elite performance, it's not about constant maximum effort all the time. It's just about getting results. If you can recognize where you're veering off to the left, and you can just recognize this is where I always veer off, and you can just correct that, you can save yourself so much hassle, and you can achieve so much more with less effort.
Going really fast in the wrong direction is not helpful to the business.
But it feels exciting. And that's the whole dangerous thing. Have you ever felt like you're doing all the right things, working hard, showing up every day, but for some reason, you're still not seeing the level of success that you know you're capable of? Maybe you're constantly grinding, but the results don't match the effort, or you're playing it safe and afraid to rock the boat. Or maybe you're making things way harder than they need to be by overcomplicating and trying to prove people wrong and burning yourself out in the process. Now, what if I told you that the reason you're stuck isn't about talent or skill or even motivation? It's because of how your mind reacts under pressure. And whether you realize it or not, you're likely playing out of one of the three patterns that sabotage high performers. We're calling it the go harder guy, the Mr. Nice guy, or the chip on the shoulder guy. It needs to prove people wrong. So let's talk about these. The go harder guy. First is you always push, you never rest. Your desire to get shit done can cause a lack of strategic focus. And everybody calls you very intense, but you can't see it in yourself until you actually burn yourself out. Then we have the Mr. Nice guy. You play it safe, you say yes too often and don't want to upset people. You optimize for optics. So you undercharge or keep people around you who shouldn't be there just to avoid that confrontation or the uncomfortable conversation. And finally, there's a chip on the shoulder, the prove you wrong guy. And this is where you prioritize proving someone or something wrong instead of going after what you actually want. So you often overcomplicate things or make them harder than they need to be just to prove your worth and how capable you are. And these three archetypes are an idea that I first came across when working with all the high-level entrepreneurs, elite athletes, and operators that I've worked with throughout my career. And these were people that were functioning at a very high level, yet they all had one thing in common. When things got very challenging and they felt a lot of pressure, their minds pulled them into one of these three emotional survival patterns. And these were patterns that didn't serve them. And again, it wasn't about whether they were capable, it was about whether they could recognize and override these patterns before they derail their success. So here's the deal. Again, you don't need another productivity hack or motivational speech. What you probably need if you're listening to this podcast is to understand how your mind reacts under pressure, what's driving that reaction, and how to shift it. And that's what today's episode is all about. Okay, the goal is that by the end of this episode, you'll know exactly which of the three archetypes you default to, why it's holding you back, and most importantly, how to break free from it so you can operate at your highest level without all the unnecessary stress, hesitation, or burnout. Okay, we're going to go deep into each archetype, breaking down how they show up in your life and giving you real strategies to actually take control. Now, whether you're going to find yourself being the go harder guy who thinks pushing harder is always the answer, the Mr. Nice guy who avoids the necessary confrontation, or the chip on the shoulder guy who makes everything harder just to prove a point, this episode will help you get out of your own way and unlock your full potential. All right, so let's get to it. First off, Alex, thank you for coming on board. Before we get started, anything that you want to add to these archetypes or what we're talking about today?
Thank you, Itamar. It's great to be here. There's nothing I want to add. It's a very interesting topic. I can see a little bit of myself in all of those, and I'm interested to unpack these in more detail.
Yeah. So like you said, it's very common. Like everybody usually see themselves in a mix. I've not really met one person who's just one of them. Usually we have kind of one dominant archetype inside of us and possibly a second or possibly a third. But it's usually kind of a mix. But it's if we can identify what is the most important one that really causes us to veer off of, let's call it strategic performance and go into kind of an emotional reaction, we can stop it. So the first one I want to talk about is the go harder guy. And we'll probably talk about this guy a little bit more at length. The reason being is that out of all the clients that I've worked with, the guys who tend to succeed more actually have the go harder in them more. Like it seems to be the dominant one. The reason is because, as that old saying goes, like action is the cure all. These guys take a lot of action. And that's a superpower of the go harder guy. So to kind of explain the go harder guy, we'll go into it. The go harder guy is all gas and no brakes. Every time there's tension or discomfort, his only solution is to push harder. People around him call him things like intense, but he doesn't see himself that way. He thinks he's only slightly above average, despite working relentlessly with tireless focus. And as a result, he sometimes burns through employees by pushing them at an unsustainable pace, all while thinking this isn't half of what I can do. And his body usually pays the price as well. We've all known these guys, injuries usually pile up from previous sports because they kept going without slowing down. And that's usually the typical guys. Now, the important thing with the go harder guy to recognize is that with all these archetypes, there's an upside to this behavior and there's a downside to it. We're not saying this is just bad, but if you can understand the upside of it and keep doing that, but control the downside of it, that's when it's really powerful. So first off, any questions about the go harder guy before we really dive into it?
No questions, but yeah, I can see a bit of this in myself.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of it in all of us. So I kind of share a story. There was one guy I work with that, and again, these are all going to be included in the book, that he was a classic definition of a go harder guy. He just had a big exit in one of the companies in his portfolio, and he wanted to take things to the next level. And again, his drive, his effort, all these things were why he had this portfolio in the first place. But what happened was that he was so focused on just constantly going harder that he wasn't able to actually utilize his biggest strength. This wasn't his drive, but his intelligence and strategic vision. Like, he'd wake up at 3 a.m. to go to the bathroom and he'd immediately be like, you know what, I'm up, I got to go to work. So he wouldn't sleep a lot. And because he was sleep deprived, he wasn't thinking as clearly as he could. And he would constantly be the cycle of trying to work, when actually he had a lot of opportunities. If he could just think strategically, he could magnify everything. And it was one of those paradoxical situations that his drive and always going harder is what got him here, but his strategic ability is what's going to get him to the next level. And it was very challenging for him because he said, this was giving me my success. All this motivation, constantly just trying to do one more, just trying to go that extra mile, whatever it may be. But it was what's holding him back. And the best analogy that I can give of it is think of it like a race car. Like, you do need power, and that's your drive and work ethic. And if you have that, that's amazing. But you also need precision and control. Like, flooring the gas pedal through every single turn isn't just inefficient, it's unsustainable. It's dangerous and eventually causes things to break. And elite performance, it's not about just constant maximum effort all the time. It's just about getting results. And a lot of times for the people that like to go hard and they say that's my calling card, it's challenging to recognize that you need to actually slow down a little bit in order to take the strategic route, not just go as hard as you can in whatever direction you can go. So for a lot of these guys, it's not about working harder, it's about working smarter. With that, let's open this up a little bit. I saw you also created a bit of a SWOT analysis about the go harder guy, all these characters from the book. What are your thoughts on this, Alex?
First of all, my obvious bias is I align quite closely to the go harder guy. I think that it solves potential inefficiencies or lack of information just through brute force and volume. And so whether people are applying this to their business, to their health, to their relationships, then it's a clunky tool, but could be effective. I think the go harder guy and the chip on the shoulder guy obviously have maybe some attributes which are quite similar.
Overlap. Yep.
Yeah. And I think that the definitions of the go harder would help me understand it in more detail. So I guess one question I might have for you is, would you qualify someone as, or traits as being a go harder persona based on the relative change from their previous behaviors? So if somebody was focusing on their marriage, for example, and their marriage had been neglected for a period of time, but they just overcompensate, they just dedicate a huge percentage of time, so it's relative change to the previous behaviors? Or is it relative to near peers? Or is it simply just a more than necessary? So the degree of input was more than necessary for the outcome.
That's a great question. So I would say relative to what's effective. That's always what we're measuring on. It's not the peers, not my past, but what's effective. So we talk about this kind of performance pressure bell curve a lot, right? That if there's just a little bit of pressure, you underperform. If there's a right amount of pressure, you're this like peak performance zone. And then if there's too much pressure, you start doing things that don't really serve you and you start to underperform. Whether that you have too much pressure causes anxiety, causes overwhelm, whatever it may be. Now, the go harder guys, their reaction to feeling a sense of overwhelm or anxiety is to be like, let me just go harder. Let me just do more effort, more force. Instead of saying sometimes, actually, is this the right place to go to actually drive this force? It's about being able to control your emotional response so that it doesn't cause you to be ineffective. And again, like the go hard is like how you said, like, oh, it's effective. I'm doing something. And that's the thing that can really trick them. And again, like, I'm one of these as well. They're like, oh, something feels wrong. Let me just do more. Instead of often saying, I need to take a step back, not have that emotional reaction. And my emotional reaction is just to do. Instead of saying like, okay, how can I step back and think strategically about this? So it's not necessarily compared to this person or that person or my past. It's about like, what would be the strategic thing to do here? Is to actually just go harder and do more? Or is it take a step back? And a very clear example of this is, for example, with a lot of these guys, they burn out their C-suite because they just drive them at a certain pace. Now, obviously, they know that having to rotate through a new COO every year isn't a very effective thing. Like, there's a lot of drag that comes with it, a lot of challenges. But they sometimes they can't help themselves emotionally. And that's the thing. They're like, oh, we just got to drive. And that's what I'm saying. It's just not effective. So we'll think, okay, like I do want people that are naturally driven. Like I want a COO that can take on a lot, but I also have to taper that a little bit to make sure that I'm not driving them at a pace that's unsustainable and then that's going to crash. And again, we're just not performing at our best as a company. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that personality type, especially from the scrappy entrepreneur sort of avatar where you're managing 1,000 things and scrappy is the formula for success. There's probably a trend of entrepreneurs who go from scrappy entrepreneur as the business now has traction, the org structure is starting to balloon, carrying on the same habits, the chaos, the need for speed. Maybe they're saying, what got you here won't get you there. As they start to move into a real CEO capacity where you have a C-suite under or beside you, I think that sometimes that hangover of scrappy entrepreneur in the early days starts to present itself a little bit in a more formalized CEO capacity as business grows.
Yeah, like the way I agree with you. And I think the way I would say it in a bit of a different way is that going harder when you have no leverage behind you is all you have. Like you're just doing a lot. However, when things change and the business grows, you have just you have people, you have cash, whatever it may be, all these assets, you have all of a sudden leverage. And if you're just going harder and you're not actually thinking, but you're just doing and going harder, it's not as advantageous anymore. You're actually missing out on the biggest opportunities. And that's exactly what happened with that client. Like as soon as we got him to stop going harder, we made a rule that he can't wake up before 5:30 a.m. He's not allowed to stay in bed. Just like a couple of simple rules like that. And all of a sudden, he was able to actually think a lot more clearly. And because he thought more clearly when opportunities came along, he basically 6x his whole portfolio of it. Wow. And that would not have been available to him if he was just going. He wouldn't have been able to have that strategic insight. And with the going harder guy, again, like it's a superpower to be able to go that hard. But when it comes to a point where it compromises your ability to think strategically because you're so busy doing, instead of thinking about the big play and one of the assets I hold, what's this chessboard, that's when it actually is ineffective as far as your performance.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
It definitely does. And so I'm assuming that part of the process you're working with the clients is helping them actually identify what is performance. Like how would we define performance? There's a lot of action to generate an outcome. But the practical example of this just recently is I had a business partner here from overseas, and I was teaching him how to shoot pistols. And I've had the fortunate experience of learning with some high-level competition shooters and some special operations guys. And as a student myself, and also in other areas of life, a teacher, I was trying to piece together how would I re-engineer this process based on what I've learned in the past? So the number one thing is accuracy. Right? If the bullets are going everywhere, then what's the point? And so I've got a different approach to ingraining that. And then some questions from my business partner who I was teaching was, well, how fast should I be going? And well, as fast as you can whilst staying really accurate. Really, really accurate. So what I was trying to play with is these variables of speed, accuracy, and the speed is probably applicable in business to as fast as possible, whilst the context being staying profitable, whilst maintaining this team. And it was really interesting sort of concept to be playing with him in a practical setting, because the second we lose accuracy, speed is irrelevant. Going really fast in the wrong direction is not helpful to the business. But
it feels exciting. And
it feels exciting.
That's the whole dangerous thing. It's like it naturally feels exciting because a lot is going on. There's a lot of adrenaline, and also what adds on to that is that a lot of times we've learned that going fast gets us results.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the thing to unwind, that it does get you results, but you could have such better results. And when you're saying what does this all come down to? Performance is just about results. People can put all this how are you performing? It's just, what are the results that you're achieving? Are they the maximum results that you should be able to achieve? And that's the whole deal. If they go harder, people they can achieve really good results, but they can achieve even better ones if they're able to calm down just enough, not entirely, but just enough to think strategically as well. Mm-hmm. To channel that energy not into just going and doing, and then getting so tired from it that they have to take a week off, or that they're burnt out, or they're not even thinking clearly anymore, and they're making bad decisions. But say, how can I keep myself at a certain pace where even though it feels like I could be doing more, I purposely just pull back a little bit so my mind is fresh and I'm making really smart strategic decisions. Mm-hmm. That's where the power is for them.
Mm-hmm. Could I share a visual analogy I was just thinking of to get your opinion on? And if I was looking at this like a maze, and I had 3 rats in a maze, 3 different sort of personas, and I'm looking at it from a bird's eye view. At the start of the maze, it's very straight. There's a long, straight run. So the go harder guy is essentially the go hard guy. They're out in front. And so their reinforcement at this point of the maze, there's been no deviations available to them, but they're leading. So they're reinforcing speed is good, forward momentum is good, action is good. And then you start having some forks in the road and some paths to go down. Rather than actually analyze the fork in the road, they're just making a gut feel and going as fast as possible down the gut road, because the reinforcement up until that point was go as hard and fast as possible. So they don't stop to pause when there's a critical decision to be made. They just make a hard decision and follow the decision as fast as possible. And when they get to a wall, even though climbing over that wall metaphorically might be the unlock to their business, the wall feels like resistance. So it's easier just to turn right or left or go backwards and just keep running as hard and fast as possible.
So interestingly enough, with these guys, what I've seen a lot of times is that when they hit a wall, their reaction is, how can I just burst my head through it? How can I break through it? Mm-hmm. Because again, it's I just need to go. I need more force. That's always the answer. More power, more force. When a lot of times it could be the strategic, them stopping and asking, do I actually have to go through this wall, or is there a path of lesser resistance somewhere where there's a bigger opportunity? That's the challenge for them, is to get out of that mindset of I just need to go. They a lot of times inherently view stopping or taking. So they would view, if I told them, listen, you need to stop and relax, they'd say, I'm absolutely not willing to do that. That does not work for them. That goes against every fiber of their nature. But if I tell them, hey, what if we just take a strategic perspective on this? So we're just going to you're not going to stop. You're not going to relax, because I know you don't want to do that, but you're just going to go into recovery mode a little bit. I know you're a bit burnt out from this project. So we're going to our focus right now, you're going to get really aggressive about recovering. They're like, oh, I can get aggressive about recovering if you phrase it like that. They buy into that. And then, okay, now the goal is you're not just going to stop and wait for opportunities to come to you. You're going to go into a very focused season of exploration. That's your focus right now. What possible opportunities are ahead of you? You're like, oh, okay, I can go hard at that. So you got to give them a frame to look at things so they can keep feeling like they're doing they're going hard and they're being that dude. But it's really about just helping them avoid chronically burning out and just performing at less than their full capacity, because they're just always on the edge, always redlining it, so to speak. And when we're redlining it again, most of the time, especially if you have leverage behind you and your decisions are really impactful, that's not a great solution as a default. It's great that you still have that in you when things happen, chaos, whatever, a crisis happen, you can have that in you, you have that go. But as a default, it's probably not the best solution.
That's really, really helpful. I've made that mistake countless times, and I think for the go harder personality, there's probably a sub personality, without getting unnecessarily complex, where you can become the breakthrough walls guy. And the more innovative you are, or the more difficult the industry or business in, if it's a novel concept, just like the speed can be a self-reinforcing attribute. I think that the knocking through walls, it might have been successful in the past. There's many times where I could look at what I was doing in business as defining myself as being a professional door knocker or wall breaker, and the only formula is, bang the wall harder and faster and don't stop until it's going, not realizing there's an open door right next door. And I think that can also become a self-reinforcing habit of even artificially creating friction, because we've been historically good at getting through it in the past. So I can see a lot of downstream unintended consequences by being the go harder guy.
And again, I want to kind of bring this all home. The reason there's so much value in these archetypes is that if you're self-aware of what your natural defaults are, you can then start correcting for it. So for example, if someone's listening into this right now, they're like, you know what? I actually don't have that at all. I don't empathize with this at all, with this go harder personality. Reality is you probably need to learn how to push yourself a bit harder, because you're actually missing out on some performance by not having enough of that go in you. However, if you're saying, I see myself in this, it's like I sometimes go over the top, I burn myself out, I get physically injured in sports because I never take a day off, and I have all these issues. And to recognize, you know what, this is kind of the example of, if my car is always veering left, I need to correct it by tilting the steering wheel a little bit to the right. This is how I veer left. So I recognize this is where I need to go. So for me, example, I am also one of those go harder guys. And for me, the question now that I have is sometimes, when you wake up and you're really, really, really sore and you ask yourself, should I do this workout today? So what life has taught me through various injuries is that if I ever ask myself, should I do this? It is an absolute no. I should not work out today. I should take a recovery day. And the same thing kind of with the business stuff. With a lot of these guys, if they're saying, should we just push through with this? Should I just push through? It's like, if you're that guy, again, unless it's an acute crisis where there's a very specific reason this is happening now, and it's not just how you're answering every question throughout the entire year, then no, you should probably back off a little bit, recover, so you're actually at your best, and then you can think strategically and employ your intelligence, not just your drive. Again, the whole bet is that you're more than just your work ethic. You're also an intelligent individual. And by you constantly going harder, you're actually not allowing that part of yourself that's intelligent and clever and can think about creative solutions to come out, because you're always just basically exhausted.
That's brilliant. One thing I've been trying to recalibrate my perspectives on, thankfully through knowing you, is looking at, previously I looked at working hard as being a superpower, just push through things. I've been able over time to view that differently and view that as a requirement that may or may not be necessary, and that working really hard might just be a reflection of inadequate skills or inadequate or ineffective strategy. So if it took me 6 hours to cut down the same tree that took you 6 minutes, me defining myself as being a hard worker doesn't help the cause. I'm still really ineffective.
I know I'm not usually the best at these analogies, but it's kind of like just having one tool in your tool belt. If all you believe is that I can just do this through hard work, it's like you're just not a very effective builder or creator, whatever it may be, if that's all the tools that you have. And again, the problem with a lot of these go harder guys, you're a great example of this. You're extremely, extremely intelligent. Like you absolutely could figure out how to do this in 30 minutes instead of 6 hours. However, if all you're thinking to yourself, the only tool I have is to go really hard at this, then you're just not going to give yourself permission to access that intelligence. And that's what I've seen with most of these guys. Like guys that we've had on the podcast previously, like Scott is a great example of this. We've had him on the podcast previously. Hyper intelligent individual. However, because he always goes so hard at things, he's only at 60, 70% of his intellectual capacity types because he's so tired. And again, my bet when I see him as his coach, I'm like, we're going to be much more effective if we get you somewhere close to that 90% and you work at only a 70% capacity, but you're utilizing 90% of your intelligence rather than vice versa. And again, it's just recognizing you have more tools in your toolkit. That is not it. It's not the only thing.
Have you recognized a trend in go harder guys that should they be presented with evidence that there's not a different way of doing things? You know, the 5-hour job got done in 5 minutes. That it might not necessarily be received with a overwhelming sense of enthusiasm and excitement. It might be almost met with either disappointment or confusion because they're so reinforced into positive things require sacrifice, time, difficulty, complexity, etc.
I'll answer this in a bit of a different way. So a big part of once they experience it, they actually experience like, okay, this is actually more effective. They're usually on board with it. Like sometimes they need to be reminded of it. Hey, remember when we did this and it actually really helped you? They're like, yeah, I'm defaulting back into that again, right? Like, yes. But in order to get them to actually experience it, there's a lot of psychological trickery, so to speak. So again, like what I said at the beginning, I will never expect. So I actually just gave a talk about a month ago, and I met somebody who had an exit for 9 figures, like big exit. And he asked me like, how can I go about this? I want to figure out the next thing, And it was very clear that he was tired from what he just got out of. And he was about to jump into whatever came next into his radar so he can just do. You know what I mean? It was an emotion like, I want to do. I'm a doer. Yeah. And I was like, hey, man, what if you thought about this as a very active season of exploration where your job isn't to do something, but just to explore opportunities? And then his eyes were like, ooh, I can do that. That sounds like a really smart thing to do. And emotionally, I feel comfortable with that. So it's about kind of introducing these frames of thought and how they could buy into that, but still get the result of actually forcing them to slow down a little bit so they can recover their energy and think strategically. And then once they do that and they experience like one cycle of this, and we can always talk back to them and be like, hey, remember when you did this and it worked really, really well? They're like, oh yeah, like what do you think if we do it again? They're like, okay, so then again, we frame it as well. Like we also give it that little bit of trickery so they feel psychologically safe with it, that it's okay. I'm not just like being lazy. I'm just focusing very aggressively on my recovery. And they kind of buy into it. It's these kind of cycles.
Yeah, I think that's great. Focusing very intensely on recovery or focusing very intensely on a season of curiosity, because I definitely have felt that jury in my head that even if there's a more efficient path, calling myself, viewing my actions as being lazy. I think, just recalibrating or
it's a little hack
is really helpful. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, cool. So that is the Go Harder Guide. Any last questions before we move on to the Mr. Nice Guy?
No, that summarized it great.
Cool. So the Mr. Nice Guy is the second archetype. And again, there's positives and negatives to this one as well, with all of them. That's important to understand. The Mr. Nice Guy is all accommodations and no boundaries. Every time there's tension or discomfort, his default solution to that kind of pressure is to accommodate. People might say about him, he's so generous or so nice and helpful, but the reality is that it often hurts his success. He thinks he's just building relationships despite chronically undercharging or over-delivering or just overextending himself. And as a result, he drains himself by trying to please everyone at an unsustainable pace, all while thinking like, once people see this value, once I can help them, whatever it may be, I can start asking for more or getting more. And he usually pays the price for this both in his business and his personal life. In business, profits stay low from keeping underperforming employees because, they're like family, or undercharging clients, and from seeking permission to do things instead of just executing. In his personal life, old relationships he's often outgrown turn into these points of resentment or anchors that hold him back. But again, he doesn't feel comfortable breaking free from them. Now, again, with same thing with the Go Harder guy, the Mr. Nice guy, there's benefits to him. Like building relationships and being able to be thoughtful of other people and caring and being empathetic, it's a superpower. It can really, really help you. Now, again, going back to your question, the moment you can actually see that it's ineffective, that you're going it too much onto the end of it, and it's actually coming at the cost of your success and what you want out of life, that's when it's actually detrimental. So you can ask yourself again, like, where am I in this Mr. Nice Guy spectrum? Am I at a place where I'm actually selfish, uncaring, unhelpful, I have a bad reputation, where actually me being nicer to people and more helpful will boost my performance and get me better results? Or is it a place where I don't do this from a strategic perspective, but I do this from an emotional compulsion? Whenever I feel a bit of pressure, I'm like, I'll accommodate. And I kind of like acquiesce to people. That means it's probably not a helpful thing anymore. And it's something you have to rein back in. Recognize that's an emotional response of yours that's not effective. It's not helping you. So before we dive a bit more into that, any questions so far?
My initial question on the Mr. Nice Guy is based on the clients that you work with. Obviously, they're at a pretty high level of success to be working with you. Have you found that certain industries or functions within certain companies attract more of the Mr. Nice Guy? Like they sort of tend to sort of data group around either more creative industries?
It's a really good question. I can't say that it stands out as one kind of industry. What I can say though is about what I've seen the pattern from all the Mr. Nice Guy that's very interesting is that they usually have the biggest relative shift as far as their income once they go through the coaching and kind of get that unlocked from them. So the Go Harder guys, like they'll take their company like from 3 million to 8 million. You know what I mean? Like they'll have a 2-point-something X return because they already have a lot of bet and they just have a lot of go in them. The Mr. Nice guys will often take their company from mid-6 to mid-7 because the reality is they already had so much stuff in reserve. Like they already had so many assets they were waiting to put out, or they already had built so many relationships. They were just never comfortable actually trying to, have a win-win-win, but we're always only just giving, that they have so much stuff in the background that's just ready to kind of get unleashed as soon as they give themselves permission. So even though they might not have the biggest companies, like the Go Harder guys, like usually the 9-figure guys that I talk to, they're Go Harder. But these guys, they have the biggest multiple once they unlock it, so to speak. So even if the overall isn't as big, it's the biggest multiple just because they've held back so much. They haven't given themselves the permission to really go for it or to do the right thing or to have that conversation, whatever it might be.
That's actually a really interesting comparison for me to think through is the Go Harder person, and just to illustrate the point, is massive generalization, but they might have a slightly lower value proposition in the market that they've maximized through brute force. Whereas the Mr. Nice Guy might have, again, generalization, a larger value proposition in the market, which has reached a level of success, in spite of how they operate, not because of it. And that uncoupling some of those emotional needs that they're trying to tick off throughout their business might be the cutting of the anchors, which lets them march forwards.
Let's say it in a bit of a different way. I think the Mr. Nice guys, they oftentimes have, let's call it like just for the simplicity of language, they have $1 million business in their hands right now, but they only give themselves permission to have a $300K business. Gotcha. And that's the thing. It's like whether it's because of the pricing, whether it's because of certain employees that don't need to be there but are just dragging it down, whatever it may be. It's like they have everything in place. They've already built enough assets, enough reputation, whatever it may be, to have a much bigger business right now if they give themselves permission to do it. And like a classic example of it, of someone who's also been on the pod and just like a star, is Ben. And I think you met him at one of the events, but like, dude's a star. And like when he started out, he was charging I think he was making about $5K a month from his CFO services. And there were people that were getting lesser results than him, charging $25K a month in the same like industries. And it was just a matter of like him recognizing that it's perfectly fine to charge a lot and deliver a lot at the same time. That like having a win-win is better than just being nice, and helping others while helping yourself is the right way. And like he, as soon as he started like recognizing that, he had a bunch of climbs, a bunch of like trajectories. So like first off, he started charging what he should be charging, and his income all of a sudden grew to like clear income of, I don't want to put this out there, but his income grew a lot. And then at the end of it, he also basically right now, the recent thing he did, he acquired 5 businesses of his own. He gave himself room to say, I'm going to acquire 5 businesses. Yeah, and he just lives in that. He can, if he wants, to live off that passive income just from those businesses. And he was a classic example of someone who had a phenomenal skill set. It's just about the permission to say, okay, I don't have to be nice. I can actually get what I want as well and do it in a way that serves.
Right. So he was unnecessarily bringing either personal needs or wants into his business, and his business was compensating for that. And yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and it's a great way you've said it. And it's like, it's these emotional wants, like they're across all the archetypes. The Mr. Harder wants a sense of excitement and adrenaline. So he brings that into the business instead of being strategic. The Mr. Nice Guy wants to feel appreciated, wants to be told like they're good, wants to get approval, whatever it may be. So instead of making the right strategic decisions, they make emotional decisions that could give them that approval. So for example, if I'm being over nice and I'm giving you, like, let's say we're a deal or a partnership, and logically it should be 50-50, but I'm like, you know what? You have 90%. I'll have 10%. That doesn't actually serve me. However, you will absolutely tell me, Itamar, you're such a great guy. That is so generous of you. That's amazing. And that can make me feel so nice inside. And I can end up prioritizing that instead of what's actually strategic and effective for what I truly want. Because the reality is, most likely than not, a year or two later, I'll be like, man, that wasn't a great deal for me. But in the moment, it made me feel good about myself.
Absolutely. Anytime in business where, and usually it's always with the benefit of hindsight or new perspectives, new skills, where I can look back and say, I was absolutely making an emotional decision there rather than a strategic decision. Any benefit I experienced in the short term by either the feeling was a huge compounding tax I had to pay at some point later, because I was avoiding what was actually strategically correct to be doing at the time. So
yeah, so, and again, kind of cap it in. That's all we're trying to do with these archetypes. That's the beauty of them. If we can understand, I associate with the go harder guy. I associate with the Mr. Nice Guy. And like, okay, I have these emotional needs. So I need to be aware of that. Because again, my car always tilts left, and I just to correct it a little bit, the steering wheel to the right. And recognize that whenever I'm about to enter any kind of negotiation, any kind of process, whatever, those are my emotional needs that I'm bringing to the table that aren't actually going to serve me, that aren't going to be effective. And that's going to ruin my performance and not being effective. That's how it all ties back.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. So let's move on to the final one. And like you said, this one has a bit of an overlap. The chip on the shoulder guy or the prove you wrong guy. They end up having similar actions to the go harder in a lot of ways. Like it looks like that from the outside, but it comes from a different place. And this is important to understand. So the chip on the shoulder guy filters everything through the lens of proving his worth and his ability. Often to people from his past who told him he wasn't enough. He's incredibly talented, but makes choices based on what will demonstrate his capabilities rather than what actually works best. He builds these really elaborate systems when simple ones would do. He takes the hardest path to every goal and prioritizes oftentimes even vanity metrics over results. And he exhausts himself trying to prove points that don't need to be proved. He thinks to himself the whole time, this will prove how capable I am, and his results usually pay the price too. Like progress stalls from optimizing for things that will feed his ego instead of actually getting him results. And again, like we talk about the positive and the negative. The positive of the prover guy is wrong, and I can tell the chip on the shoulders that a lot of guys are like, man, that got me out of a really dark place though. Like I was very lazy in high school, or I wasn't great at college, or whatever it may be. And having this thing I need to prove people wrong, it's what got me my success. And I think this is really important, that whole proving someone wrong can be an amazing fuel to get you out of a bad situation, but it's not a great compass after that. And that's where things can get challenging. it can take you in all these kind of weird directions where instead of saying like, what's the most direct path to success? You start saying, how can I prove people wrong? How can I make them think, oh, he's very talented. Oh, he's very clever. Oh, he's very smart. And that's when we start to just do things that aren't the like path of least resistance or the simplest path to our success, the most direct path to success. And that's when, again, like we tie it back to performance and effectiveness. It's where, again, it was really great to get you out of a dark place. It's not a great compass to get you to your next level of success. You can start optimizing for proving people wrong instead of what will be the easiest way to achieve success. Yep. I can see you're nodding along with this.
Yeah.
Very passionate agreement.
I've played this out in both ways. One would be in innovation, where innovation in the past might have been an unlock to your business success, is innovating for the sake of innovation rather than using an existing tool that would have got the job done. Or like the Elon Musk quote, the greatest, what did he say? The greatest infliction that most smart engineers have is identifying, automating, and optimizing something which shouldn't exist. And I think that ticks the box of unnecessary complexity, unnecessary sort of innovation cycles, is trying to solve an emotional problem of I am smart, I am capable, rather than which screw goes into the right hole to make this machine turn.
Yeah.
So I made both mistakes, both on the innovation or the optimization, unnecessarily to solve internal emotional needs rather than external business strategic requirements.
I think we've all done that, man. I think it's very rare that I've met someone that doesn't have some level of this, like a little chip on their shoulder, wanting to prove people wrong or whatever it may be. I think this was something that I remember I had a conversation with a friend when I was just starting out this business. And I don't remember exactly what the topic was, but he's like, why do you want to do this? I was like, oh, I think this will be like a really great way to prove that I have a really strong mindset, that I'm doing something that's very challenging and all that. And he's like, what if instead you do something that's easier and then build it bigger? And I was like, I do not like the truth and simplicity of what you just said. And it was very clearly that that's what I was trying to do. I was just trying to prove something instead of saying what's the most effective thing. And he, as an outsider, didn't have any attachment to my emotional needs. He was saying to me, that's not effective. Why don't you just do this? Like, building a big business is going to be hard no matter what. So just try to make it as easy as possible. And it's interesting when you brought that word up about innovation, because when I actually think about it, that's the pattern I see with all these guys. When that's their dominant trait, it's all about how can I innovate things that don't need to be innovated? Like, instead of running this playbook that has worked for everybody, how can I just do this on my own and be a special snowflake? Or how can I just do something, or not even a lot of times they don't give themselves permission to actually do the thing until they can put their own stamp of uniqueness on it. Mm-hmm. Like, if this is, for example, these guys, they never run for right now, a great opportunity is to run an AI agency, right? You're just going to build AI agents. Pretty simple, out of the box, people will need it. They will see that opportunity and they will not do it unless they can put their own special little spin on it. Even if there's such like a gaping hole in the marketplace that they know they will get paid, they won't be able to get themselves to do it until they put their own unique little spin on it. And again, that's just not effective as far as performance and getting the results that you want.
Yeah, I think I still struggle with that. There's probably a lot of opportunities which I've glossed over because I couldn't put my special little spin on it. And
so let me ask that, like, where do you feel that's coming from? Like, why? What will that give you if you can put your own special, unique spin on it?
It will give me emotional recognition. I am smart. I am capable.
Yeah. And it's like, that's like we've said with all this stuff, that's a challenge. Like, when we bring our emotions into decision making, we're not performing at our best. And the whole point, like, I hope this is like also like something that this is something I use these archetypes to recognize about myself. Like, oh, I'm this guy, I'm that guy now. Is to recognize, like, if that's what's going on, that I probably shouldn't trust myself right now. Mm-hmm. If I'm initially defaulting saying like, oh, I shouldn't do this because I can't put my unique print on it. Like, oh, no. That's that prove you wrong part about me. That's that chip on my shoulder that I recognize always steers me in the wrong direction. And it's interesting that you said those words, because in the book, in the bottom of the chapter or the section about the prove you wrong guy, the chip on the shoulder guy, it says, when it comes to results, normal drive plus strategic direction is better than hyper drive, where you're super motivated, super interested, super fascinated, but with emotional direction.
Mm.
And that's the thing we're saying. Like, a lot of times these chip on the shoulder guys are saying, I don't want to let this chip go, because that's what gives me my drive. It's like, it's what got me out of that really dark place, and it's my fuel. And the reality is, what I've seen from people that are able to let go of this, even if they do lose a little bit of their drive, which honestly doesn't happen much, because it's almost become a habit at this point where they just go. But even if they do lose some of their drive, but they're able to channel that energy in a strategic place with the path of least resistance, they actually achieve better results than somebody who's hyperdrive but just going all over the place, or avoiding the things that could be easy to get them results, because it's not unique. It's not going to fulfill that emotional need, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yes, powerful.
Yeah. So, any questions about the prove you wrong guy?
No further questions. I think you've explained it really well.
Cool. So I want to kind of bring up the last point, which is really interesting, because before we talked about the podcast, you kind of created this analysis, and you created this ideal performer guy. Can you talk about kind of like, what were your thoughts about how can we create this person?
Sure. So I think I understand the categorizations of the different personas. I think I understand there's some cross sections. And as a visual thinker, anytime I feel there's a cross section, or where is there convergence, where is there divergence, Venn diagrams will come to mind. And what I was trying to do was to, first of all, clarify, is my understanding of these personas, that from a SWOT analysis, just using a simple tool to understand them, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for each persona. And then, is there an ability to create the ultimate persona, the ultimate Swiss Army knife of those personas, where I can maximize the positives, I can go hard and make friends along the way and keep everyone happy, and do things sort of creatively and prove all the haters wrong. So is there a potential to create a new persona which maximizes the upsides of those three archetypes, and then minimizes the downsides?
Yep. So it was interesting that you brought that up, because I think that's how we all naturally kind of default, saying like, how could I focus on the ideal version? And like, I saw that you even like, I think you got ChatGPT to create the 10 golden rules to achieve peak performance, like from all these archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, think about it this way. If you brought in a really, really smart consultant into your business, and they were like, okay, like, here's the 10 laws of business, you should be doing this. You'd be like, okay, that's kind of helpful. But if you brought someone else in, they were like, okay, these are your exact issues. These are the exact issues that you guys have in your business. And this is how you need to make sure that they don't cause you to slip up, and this is how you need to fix them. You'd probably think the second guy is more valuable, right?
Sure.
And that's why we try to create these archetypes, because instead of just saying, okay, here's the ideal, like just strive for this ideal, so notice these are your specific weak points. These are your performance vulnerability points, it's called. So you don't need to think about how does this ideal archetype work out, but recognize this is who I am. So if I just know that this is where I veer to the left and I need to correct for it, I think it actually creates a better result for people as far as their ability to perform than just saying this is the 10 commandments, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
If they're like, oh, these are the 3 things I need to watch out for personally. Me personally, I think it's just more effective. But what do you think about that? Like, now kind of hearing with that perspective.
I think to go back one step there, the reason why I prompted GPT to give me the golden rules is I know that otherwise it's just this aspirational idea with no instructions with it.
Yep.
Whereas if the golden rules can be adhered to, then it's more likely to act in congruence with that archetype.
So it's like a checklist. Am I making sure that I'm not slipping into the archetypes?
Yeah, yeah. Because I recognize your point. Everyone probably goes, I would like to go hard. I would like to keep people happy along the way. And, so I understand that people would naturally default to, just like in the financial markets, people try to pick stocks and time the market. And that's why most people don't outperform the market because of our own biases or blind spots. So the golden rules was almost me trying to take a lesson out of Warren Buffett's book and say, okay, if I just did these things and viewed it as this tool, how would I avoid the common pitfalls that most people make because they default into trying to time the market or feeling like they've got a unique insider perspective. But I take a lot from your point that the specific ability to identify the specific constraint, the specific way to overcome that constraint is largely a lot more practical to the individual to generate momentum forwards as opposed to a vague aspiration and a list of rules with no specific so I guess it's a general versus specific equation from my perspective.
It's an interesting perspective, and I also share that I think it's less about how to help people move forward. It's more about how to make sure people aren't holding themselves back. Because like again, the go harder guy, the way he holds himself back is by working to almost near exhaustion and then just not being as effective as they could be. The Mr. Nice guy holds himself back by over accommodating, over pleasing, and just keeping the wrong people around him or just not asking for what he should be able to ask for. And the prove you wrong guy, he holds himself back by just creating a lot of complexity because it gives him that emotional high, that emotional kick, instead of saying, what's the path of least resistance, even if it doesn't prove anything, but just gets me the result. So these archetypes...
That's absolutely... Sorry,
go for it.
Cutting you off. I was going to say that's absolutely your superpower and something which I wish I knew how to summarize, articulate better, because I feel there's infinite information out there about how to go harder or go faster. So if I was engineering a yacht right now, this is hull designs, this is engines, transmissions. That's the wake up at 5 a.m., do the breath work, do the cold plunge, do all the things. So there's plenty of information out there about how to go harder or whatever. But if the ship is moored and it's big chains, all that stuff is completely irrelevant because the ship can't go anywhere. And a big part of your superpower, I really believe, is having an incredibly unique skill set to identify, is this person moored? How are they moored? And how do I cut those ropes so that they can move forwards? Really, like the best way to move forward isn't waking up an hour earlier or having this type of yerba mate tea. It is likely undoing the shackles that are holding you back. And I wish I knew how to articulate that better than the yacht analogy, because it's so powerful seeing that in real time. As a client of yours, a participant in Arena and Elite, is to see how quickly those unlocks actually play out in the outcomes of entrepreneurs once they can be correctly identified, understood, and then solutions of how to avoid it.
First off, I appreciate the kind words. First off, that it's something that, again, like the whole purpose of why we wrote this book is because I think the approach to mindset is kind of flawed these days. Like you said, there's enough of how to go harder. But what I also wrote in the book, which is so fascinating to me, is that when I started working with Colonel Glenn, the Mossad's chief psychologist, I expected him to actually be like, okay, this is how you overcome all these demons in your mind. This is how you push through them, how you break through them. And it was not. It was just saying, like, how can we remove the stuff from your head that causes the pressure, the emotional overwhelm, whatever it may be, so that you don't have to push harder, but you can achieve more with the same amount of effort, or even more with less effort. Like the analogy that I try to give, and again, I'm not as good as you with the analogies, is that it's not about learning to press harder on the gas pedal. Like if you're listening to this podcast, if you're the kind of person who listens to this podcast, or the kind of person who's going to read the book, you're pressing the gas. You're going for it. Even if you're, let's say, the Mr. Nice guy who sometimes doesn't feel comfortable pressing it, you still have that in you that you press the gas pedal. Your challenge is there's some kind of emotional handbrake that you're keeping there. That emotional need that causes you to not actually go full on in the right direction. And like, again, we have different emotional responses to when we feel a certain sense of pressure. The go harder guy, when he feels pressure, his answer is just to go harder. And he might go harder and to crash into a wall. The Mr. Nice guy, when he feels a sense of pressure, he'll just back off. He'll be like, okay, I just want to make sure that everyone's happy. And that, again, holds him back from success. And the chip on the shoulder guy, or the prove you wrong guy, his thing is that he feels a sense of pressure and he'll just go. Like, he'll try to go twice as fast to prove that he can go twice as fast, even if it's in the wrong direction. And if we can just understand where our emotional responses that cause us to underperform and just focus on making sure that we correct for that, that's beautiful. Like, for example, Scott and we had a session the other week and asked him how it was and how things were going. And he's like, yeah, I did this because I'm being that Mr. like the go harder guy again. And it was such a beautiful moment because he was able to utilize the language and recognize, I'm doing that. So I need to back off of it. It's like how I'm saying it. Whenever I wake up and I think, should I go do a workout or not? That probably means I shouldn't because I'm that guy that injures himself. It's the same thing. If you can just say to yourself, oh, I know I'm about to head into a negotiation or about to head into a conversation, and I know I'm usually the Mr. Nice guy, that means that I need to overcompensate to the other end and make sure that I stand up for what I need. If you're seeing an opportunity and you're saying, oh, but I know that I'm that chip on the shoulder guy and I'm going to try to overcomplicate things or try to prove that unique, what would I tell somebody else to do? If I took my emotional needs out of it, but I just wanted somebody to achieve a result really simply, really effectively, what would I tell them to do? And if you can start having these kind of conversations with yourself and using these frames, it can really be beneficial. That's why you put so much effort into putting it together. So as a kind of final self-diagnosis exercise to really identify which archetype you lean towards, I want to offer you guys one question or one challenge for each type. So if you recognize yourself as the go harder guy, ask yourself, where in my life do I need to apply strategy instead of force? Where am I too close to burnout and not allowing myself to think strategically? And where am I not utilizing all the assets and leverage that I have? If you recognize yourself in that Mr. Nice guy, ask yourself right now, where am I avoiding necessary conflict to keep people happy? This could be inside my business. It could be inside my personal life, whatever it may be. Where am I people pleasing? Or if you're on that chip on the shoulder guy that tries to prove people wrong, ask yourself, what's the simplest way to achieve my goal instead of proving a point or proving myself and how capable I am? If you can just say, oh, I'm this guy and I need to always ask myself that question, again, like how Alex was saying, it could take you away from just underperforming, not by giving you more tricks or money, but just by removing the resistance. That's why you cause yourself to underperform. So with that said, Alex, any last things before we wrap up today?
I just wanted to offer a secondary question. I think those prompts to ourselves are really, really helpful. So for the go harder guy, where in my life where would I benefit from being more strategic? People pleaser, where do I need to sort of put my foot down and sort of stand for something rather than just trying to keep everyone happy? And the chip on the shoulder guy, where do I actually need to do what's required rather than trying to sort of tick some boxes emotionally? Understanding.
So, sorry, I'm just gonna bump me there because doing what's required. Yeah, because doing what's required could be a tricky question. Because doing what's required could be what's required to give me emotional satisfaction.
Yes.
Or to feed that voice in my head. So it's really important to use the question, like, what's the simplest way to achieve this goal, to achieve the outcome that I say that I want?
Yes.
It just puts a different lens on.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you for doing that, because when I was listening to you give those prompts to ourselves, I was imagining myself having this conversation with myself or with peers, and it's not obvious to me that the answer would immediately come up. So for the go harder guy, where do you need to be more strategic? Yeah. Their answer might be nowhere. I just need to go harder. So maybe a follow-up question could be, where in your life are you experiencing friction? And they might say, my marriage or this business deal. So, okay, that might be the area where you need to be more strategic, because if you're experiencing friction right now, the go harder approach or default is not working for you. Do you see any merit in that sort of follow-up question if they ask them that initial prompt and still don't come up with any? I think it's great. Like a lot of times also a challenge is putting a constraint on it, like in kind of your way, saying, if this is the area that's challenging and if I wasn't able to go hard on it, what would I do?
And all of a sudden that takes away that default of just going hard because you're not allowed to do that. So if you had that composition in 4 hours instead of just hammering away at it at 16, what would you do? For the Mr. Nice Guy, if you weren't able to accommodate people or if you weren't able to just make this person happy, what would you want for yourself? For the Mr. Sorry, and I just want to add this last one to the last guy, the chip on the shoulder guy. A big one that I ask a lot of the clients with this is like, if no one could ever know about this, how you did it, you would never get any praise. No one would they would never be able to announce it. How would you go about it in the most simple way? They're like, that's.
Yeah, that's great. I think having a library of follow-up prompts to challenge ourselves on are really, really helpful because the gravity of that default can be quite strong, especially the longer and more successful we've been with that default archetype. So just that follow-up question of, but if you had to, so if I said, if you had to do this in 1 hour and not 1 year, how would it be done? Oh, it's not possible. It's just a long, hard grind. Yeah, but if it had to happen, well, you probably connect this dot to this dot. Great, maybe we could follow that path. So I personally really benefit from these prompts because I recognize that the solutions are likely outside of my current perspectives, and those prompts offer me an opportunity to think about it differently.
So I'll say this. First off, I'll be glad to hear because that's a big part of the bonuses we have in the book is prompts for each specific archetype. So when we go through that, there's different parts of the book about how to get clarity, about how to figure out your most direct path to action, how to remove all these kind of things in your path. There's performance anchors. And we have very specific prompts and guides and tips for each archetype. Like, this is how you need to be thinking about this if you recognize yourself as a go harder guy. So with that said, if you want to pre-order your book, you'll get access to those tips, to those guides. You can go to militaryGradeMindset.com to pre-order the book. We'll also have the link in the show notes below. And aside from that, I would love to hear your opinion, guys. If you would like to email me or DM me and just say to yourself, which archetype did resonate with the most with you and what about it hit home? I would love to hear your thoughts and your comment on this. Aside from that, and on that note, we'll end the podcast for today. I hope it was helpful for you guys. And again, it's about if you can recognize where you're veering off to the left and you can just recognize this is where I always veer off and you can just correct that, you can save yourself so much hassle and you can achieve so much more with less effort.